Hi, I'm your Howard County Executive, Calvin Ball, and you're tuned into Mako's Conduit Street Podcast. Whether you're a Maryland resident, a government official, or just someone interested in learning more about public policy in Maryland, this podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. Today we're digging into something that might sound a little bit behind the scenes and wonky, but it's where a huge amount of real policy work gets done in Annapolis, Michael.
Yep. So back like at the end of last calendar year, we did a special episode where we had listeners send us questions. I mean, we tagged it sort of like one of those ask me anything sort of deals. And we got, a couple dozen different inquiries about odds and ends, some of it like policy and politics, some of it just random stuff. But one of the interesting questions someone asked was, what's different from the insider point of view that people on the outside don't get? And I think one of our answers to that question was basically, people don't realize that a big organization like a legislature needs a lot of structure and that you have to vest a lot of authority in the committee system. And that's too hard to explain to like a ninth grade civics class, but that's really true on the ground. And that's something people don't really understand. So we sort of felt like, hey, let's try and get back to that topic and dig in more on that. And today's our opportunity to do that with, I think, the perfect guest for doing so, Delegate and Mr. Chair, Marc Korman, a longtime member of the Maryland General Assembly and a friend of the podcast, if I do say.
Chair Korman, welcome back to the podcast. Quite an intro for you, but I do think you are a friend of the podcast. I think you were one of the original, like legislator intros, if I recall. I think I remember being in your office years ago and you recording an intro.
It was so early we had to do it in person and not by Zoom, but it's great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And so before we talk about your current role as the chair of E&T, Environment and Transportation in the House, let's go back just a little bit because you spent years on the House Appropriations Committee. That's one of the most powerful committees in Annapolis. So let's first talk about that experience and then how it compares to your new role, which again, it's different in a lot of ways, but let's first talk about appropriations.
Sure. Well, appropriations is the second best committee in the House. I think you can guess what the best committee is now. But it was a great experience. appropriations gives you the chance to sort of dip into everything because everything costs money and you learn a ton about how state government works. Actually, when I was first elected, when Delegate Talmadge Branch from Baltimore was whip, one piece of advice that he gave to some people is it's really good to serve at least a few years on the Appropriations Committee because you learn quite a lot about how state government operates. And as Speaker Bush used to say, it's the one bill that we have to pass every year, the budget, that goes through appropriations. Now, of course, as this pod knows and others know, it's not really just one bill because there's also usually a Budget Reconciliation Financing Act and a capital budget. But the operating budget is the bill that we're sort of constitutionally required to finish before we go home. And of course, the committee dealt a ton with the counties and Mako because of all the state aid, which is a huge component of our state budget. So it was great on all the different policy issues and important things for the state of Maryland. I'll also say I was really lucky to just learn from some incredible personalities there. When I started, Maggie McIntosh was the chair, and my subcommittee chair on one of my subcommittees was now Speaker Jones, and my other subcommittee chair was now Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, and of course the current chair also joined the committee when I did, although he'd been serving in Annapolis longer, now Chair Ben Barnes. So it was a great group to learn from. And hopefully I did all right since then.
I think that's a good setting of the table, and I think I have a lot of clear memories of being before that Appropriations Committee with Chair McIntosh and the various leaders around the table, and that was always I don't know, I felt like that was center stage in a lot of ways, and the Appropriations Committee can be because of the far-reaching consequences of budget actions. I'm a big believer that people misunderstand and think that budgeting is just numbers, like it's green eye shades and we're running tapes and it's all math. But it's mostly policy. You express your priorities by passing a budget and deciding what things are, what things get primary funding and what things have to wait and so forth. There's a lot of policy embedded in the 1 year spending plan and the long-term, plan of what we can afford and what we can prioritize. So I think that there's a ton of policy there and people may miss that subtlety. Agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a great tool for legislative oversight. We have, a few different ways of doing that, but a big one that's, probably lesser known to, even people who listen to this podcast is the Joint Chairs Report that is part of the budget every year. And that is just full of different sort of reporting and oversight requirements for the different agencies and departments that make up state government. Now, of course, many of those are the germs for bills that can then go through the policy committees. They veer off in the budget process, but the budget is the sort of teeth to get to do some of that oversight. And I would say that's been true regardless of which party has held the governor's mansion, that we've seen the size of that Joint Chairs Report stay relatively consistent, if not growing, because it's such a great oversight tool to make sure state government is doing what we want state government to do.
Yeah, I would attest to that. That is a feature, not a bug, of the structure that we have. It's part of the state constitution's checks and balances that Maryland's constitution is unusual. The budget process is different than many states, but the notion of a legislature that is hands-on in the spending plan, but also can create conditions and limits and requirements for future spending and so forth. That is a deliberate decision by Maryland to make sure that there's broader input in the construction of future years' budgets and accountability and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know, maybe that is put a pin in for later and actually have a full episode talking about the Joint Chairman's Report and what's in it, like in one given year, but what kind of stuff has come from it in past years. That could be a future full episode, I suspect. So we'll tuck that away for now. I guess, so it is a shift going from being a member of the Appropriations Committee, but rising in leadership within the legislature, and then moving to your current committee on environment and transportation. Now, the policy areas E&T covers are really broad. I mean, MACO as the local governments are in there on a wide range of different topics. We're in your committee pretty routinely, but your stuff ranges from land use and environmental policy to transit and sort of transportation infrastructure and so forth. So sort of a different lens, but sometimes on the back end of the same decisions and policy issues that do come up in the budgeting process. Fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was the subcommittee of the chair of the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee. So there was some overlap. A lot of the natural resources, Maryland Department of Environment, Department of Transportation issues, there was some overlap. But as you know, because we only have 6 committees, each one has such broad jurisdiction.
Yeah.
We call it the Environment and Transportation Committee, but we also have housing, ethics, actually a lot of local government issues that affect you all and the municipalities within your counties. So there's a whole bunch of things that are not just in the headline name of environment and transportation for sure. And so I was lucky. I had a little bit of a head start on some of the policy areas, but a lot of it was much more new to me.
And you'll see that too, Mr. Chairman, right? When you'll see bills in E&T or in appropriations, and all of a sudden you'll see some members from another committee, either if it's a bill in E&T, you'll have a few folks from appropriations come up and sit in on a bill hearing and vice versa. And that's part of that overlap, right? Is that, so many of these issues do touch both committees and money touches everything. But I always find it fascinating when you have other committee members joining various committees because there is so much overlap.
Yeah, we have jointly referred bills, and then usually not always. The blueprint's an exception to this, right, where both committees sort of sat together as whole committees. But usually one committee has primary jurisdiction, one has secondary. And so there'll be a little field trip for some members of the secondary committee to sit in the back at the primary committee and participate in that bill hearing. And, we make room at the horseshoe for them to ask any questions that occur to them. And then that bill has to be voted through both committees. So there's definitely overlap. We only have 6 committees, though. I wonder how that overlap works with most state legislatures that have 20-something committees. Do they have 7 different committees overseeing different bills, or maybe their bills are just on more narrow topics? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there is sort of a completely different model like they use in the U.S. House of Representatives, where members serve on 5 or 6 or 8 standing committees and various subcommittees, and a bill might have to go through multiple different channels before it can get passed. Some of the states try and set up a miniature version of that system. And I don't know, when we talk to our counterparts from some of those other states, we're just shaking our heads saying, I think Maryland has this right. Wide subject matters, for a manageable number of committees. Everybody's on one committee, and you get deeper in those areas, and the other members sort of defer to them. So, I mean, I think we want to talk about the nuts and bolts of that, but I think Maryland's system is a pretty good one on balance.
Yeah, I'll just tell you a funny story. I was at a social event once with someone I knew from a different state legislature. I think I was in my 4th year, so still your first term in Maryland. In other states, that would be sort of the end of your second term. And I told them I, was not a subcommittee chair yet, and they asked what I had done wrong. And of course, in Maryland, we don't have very many first-term subcommittee chairs, so I had to sort of explain to them how our process was different than many other legislative bodies.
Yeah, I also I've heard a story of in one of our other state legislatures, who will go unnamed for this purpose, but they have term limits. I think it's a 6-year ceiling, term limits for both chambers of their state legislature. And what that's resulted in is deals being made over who's going to serve in leadership, like before people are even getting elected. They're like, by the end of our 6-year window, okay, you'll be the speaker and you'll chair this and you'll chair that, and a big handshake among each cohort. It's bananas. I mean, term limits. I don't know. That's another full episode probably.
I'll drop a hint. I think that state is one with a lot of alligators. So anybody who wants to take a guess, go ahead and try and take an educated guess there. But as we talk about committees, let's break it down a little bit for our listeners. How does a committee like yours actually function? You all are very efficient. The Environment and Transportation Committee, particularly last session, I found to be very efficient in bill hearings, voting sessions. And I know a lot of that is Trish and her team and the staff, right? But a lot of people hear about bills passing or failing. But when a bill actually gets to the floor and you're having debate, people don't realize the amount of work that has already gone into that bill. And I know for a lot of our listeners, this isn't new news, but for a lot of people, kind of explaining where the work happens, because that polished product that you see make it to the floor and everybody yells and screams about, has already gone through a ton of work, right, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I mean, I stepped into a really well-functioning machine when I started as chair in the 2023 interim. My predecessor, Kumar Barve, had a great team, including Trish, who you mentioned, who's the assistant to the chair. We have 3 sort of DLS-assigned legislative counsel. 2 of them had been with the committee for decades. They actually predated Chair Barve on the committee, so they've been there quite a while. The other counsel was new with me. Him and I were the only 2 variables. Everything else was the same well-functioning machine that Chair Barve had presided over, including all the other members except me that year were returning to the committee. I'll say every committee functions a bit differently, but I kind of think in a lot of ways E&T is the textbook committee. We have our bill hearings, and I think we're known for asking a fair amount of questions, probably not as many as our friends over the Judiciary Committee, but a fair amount of questions, do a lot of diligence. But for us, I'll say a lot of the real work is in our subcommittees, which are empowered to dig pretty deeply into the bills, asking questions, having experts there, depending on what the subcommittee chair wants, having the sponsor there, having department representatives from the departments there, other stakeholders, and they really work through the bills in great detail, line by line, put forward amendments and so forth. I'll say for me, I don't serve on any of the subcommittees, but I listen to every subcommittee meeting and certainly, will share my 2 cents. But the, subcommittees are a fairly open process. Overall, pulling the curtain back, we actually just did some quantitative analysis of the last session, and we had 427 bills before the E&T committee. That's House bills and Senate bills that came to our committee, which is the most of any House committee. We passed 162 House bills at a committee, the most of any House committee, and sent 126 House bills to the governor, the most of any House committee. So with that kind of volume, obviously in a 90-day session, we have to prioritize. So I would say the subcommittee chairs, the vice chair is also subcommittee chair, Regina T. Boyce, and I are in constant contact. We are always in constant contact with Jay Jacobs, who's our longest serving Republican member, and all the other members of the committee on both sides, trying to make sure that sort of everyone is aligned. And even though we're not all going to agree on the sort of final product, we try to stay aligned on the process, right? Here's what we're going to try to take up this week. Here's what we're going to be voting. Here's what we're voting on. So that people are not kind of surprised process-wise, and that people allow the process to continue, even if they're not always happy with, how their vote ends up on, on the end of that process. And of course, we always have to keep in mind that precious commodity of floor time. You just can't do everything you want to do, even in your own committee, because you have to think about the other 5 committees that are also sending, complicated, sometimes controversial pieces of legislation out to the floor. And, no one wants to be on the floor for 22 hours a day, right? So we need to kind of prioritize our time on the floor. And that includes thinking about what we're sending out there and how much time it's going to eat up.
So many great nuggets there. I do want to say one thing, and we'll get into everything else. You talked about, being in contact with your vice chair, and then also with the longest serving Republican member. And I want to note that, because even if somebody watches the House floor or the Senate floor in Maryland and you hear the debate back and forth, oftentimes it gets partisan, right? But if you were to watch your committee, and particularly E&T, I'll say that you see the interactions between Republicans and Democrats. They're jovial. You're right. People don't always agree, but I would say if you were just to watch that committee or just the voting sessions and watch how everyone interacts, this is not the Washington, D.C., that kind of partisanship. That's not happening. And again, you see some of that leak out to the floor, but in the committee, Mr. Chair, and I hopefully you agree, I feel like the decorum is far better than most people would think.
Yeah, I think, of course, we have our partisan blowups. They're not usually in committee. I think that's true basically of all the committees. I think they're usually on the floor, but we do have our share of partisan blowups. But overall, it's a pretty, collaborative, bipartisan or even nonpartisan environment. And I'll say, we take a fair amount of input and amendments from the minority party members. Now, look, if their goal is to come to, my committee and say climate change isn't real, that's just not going to carry the day in a majority Democratic committee. But if they have a suggestion about how we can make a bill about cooperative housing reserve funds a little bit better, we're very, very willing to take that input. And they have a lot of great experience and ideas that, help make the final product of our legislation a lot better. And sometimes that's even true when they don't ultimately vote for the final product for whatever reason. They can still offer, useful, good ideas in subcommittee or committee that help make the final product stronger.
Yeah. One more nugget that you got into with that quick download on the committee process is openness and transparency. And I think a couple quick thoughts there. One is I think that's been a hallmark in E&T since before your time, but certainly through your time as chair. And I think actually aided by the rapid advance of sort of online meeting structures. Everybody kind of got used to Zoom meetings and so forth back in 2020 and thereabouts. But now that has become a really common format we'll call a subcommittee meeting and we'll invite stakeholders to join. You can be on camera if you're asked a question. Otherwise, you can just be in the room and the members will have their back and forth and talk to committee counsel and ask their technical questions. But then stakeholders are invited to engage where they can. Being able to do that on short notice and with invitations to all the appropriate stakeholders, I think you probably feel like you're getting a better process that way. But for outsiders or semi-outsiders like us, I know we really appreciate being able to be part of those discussions and sort of in the room, even if you can't physically be in the building, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you know, it was something of a side effect of COVID that our subcommittees went much more online and our voting sessions went online. And that's
right.
Something that, I think pretty much everyone has maintained, since we were able to sort of get back into the building and back to more normalcy. As you know, a lot of our space, even after COVID, was filled with the Department of Legislative Service building refugees because that building was being rebuilt. So we didn't have a lot of spaces for subcommittees to meet. That building's open now. So we could go back to, meeting in person, but I think there's a lot of advantages for all the reasons you stated of still doing some of those functions online. If we are going to go back to sort of doing subcommittees live, I think the preference would be to have them stream the way our full committee meetings do. And, not every room in the building is wired to do that. So for now, Zoom is the best way to maintain that transparency.
Well, you talk about stakeholders being at the table. I'm not in E&T very often, I don't think at all last session. That's not one of the committees I frequent, but our colleagues are. And I'll tell you that the number of invitations to the various subcommittees in E&T I was often covering, because it's kind of like pick and choose. They are very transparent and open about inviting all the stakeholders to all the things. So I will give credit there that the various subcommittee chairs do a really good job of making sure that they can get as many voices at the table as they can, right? And so I know that I've covered a bunch of those for my colleagues, and so kudos, because I think it is the way to do it, to get as many voices at the table as you can.
Yeah. So I guess I might you dropped some numbers on trying to show the impressive overall volume that environment and transportation has to cover and the number of things that make it out of the committee. And I think that does speak to the breadth of topics that the committee members need to get up to speed on, that go through that subcommittee structure and get all that attention. I would point out that this is not just a pro forma process. It's not the role of the subcommittees to just rubber stamp, okay, these are the members we like, and we've already decided all this stuff is going to pass. Even what you mentioned, that it's a minority of the total bills introduced that will make it out of the committee. 30-40% or thereabouts is the usual. So most bills don't make it. Those that do get a good deal of attention, and the committee is really vested with a lot of judgment making about, okay, this bill has a good kernel of an idea, but we need to change these two things. We need to make some amendments and changes. You get feedback from the minority party where they've got pressure points, but maybe a bill affects one part of the state differently than other, and so forth. So the committee is usually where almost all of that work is getting done, the sort of right sizing and fitting it to the best needs, to put it on the floor in a way that should be close to consensus. That sometimes makes, we bring the seventh grade class comes to town and they sit up in the gallery and they watch the floor. And sometimes it's kind of boring that all these 138-1 votes happen on the floor of the House, because the real work is really happening in the committee. That's by design. And it's also something I think rank and file outside observers may not realize, that the committees really are where most of the action is.
Yeah, that a lot of the work, as you say, flies by on the floor when the chamber adopts the committee report, right? Which might have, maybe not usually 300, right, but 30 changes to a bill to improve it. And, they're just sort of glossed over quickly because we've, moved so much to be considered the reading of the amendments and not gone through them in great detail. For my committee, for the E&T committee, the subcommittees are the real workhorses. They're the ones that go through the bills line by line. And that's really true whether I'm the sponsor of the bill, or the governor's requested the bill, or one of the departments, or, whoever everybody's favorite member is, they still will make tweaks to bills to make them, to improve them. And we set priorities, right? We know at the beginning of a session some big things that we want to get done, but they'll still get a lot of scrutiny to make sure we're getting them done in the best way possible. Doesn't mean we always get it right. Doesn't mean we're perfect, but we definitely pressure test a lot of these things through the subcommittees and that process to try to get improved outcomes.
Right, and as a group dynamic, I think what makes the whole system work is there's a whole series of canaries up and down the coal mine here. So lots of bills, once they've been massaged and amended, are basically non-controversial, and they should be a consensus. This is fine. The committee did good work on this. But whether it's the minority party who might have a philosophical concern, or whether it's the Montgomery County delegation might have a local concern about a bill, there would be members of each committee who would run that up the flagpole and say, hey, we just passed something out of my committee. It was on a 13-8 vote. It was kind of contentious. And I was concerned. I'm going to let my delegation know that we might want to try and change it or oppose it on the floor, or that sort of thing. And in the absence of those alarms being tripped, for the most part, members have some sense that, okay, my colleagues and folks who share my point of view or my region were on that committee. They were part of that vetting process. So by the time it gets to me on the floor, the absence of anyone kicking and screaming is itself an important message for me that the work has kind of been done here.
Yeah, and frankly, advocates are a part of that process, right? When we have a bill that heavily affects counties, you often hear on the floor people ask, was anybody opposed to the bill? And if the answer is no, that sometimes ends the debate. Now, sometimes it doesn't end the debate, even though maybe it should. But advocates, can also be that sort of early warning sign. And frankly, that's a part of the process too, for advocates to be there at the witness table to, raise concerns about things. Doesn't mean they can always be accommodated either. But, more often than not, I would say we try to figure out how to address the concerns of someone who's opposed to a bill if it doesn't undermine the overall sort of purpose of the bill.
Well, really well said. And honestly, that stretch right there was the big thing that I was hoping we could get out of having you as a guest on the pod, to try and break out that concept that, the committee structure is important, and there's more to it than just every single bill gets run up the flagpole and we just take a vote, all the members, and it's 85 to 52 or whatever. It's more complicated than that, and it's for a reason, and it benefits everybody. You get the thorough attention on everything by the people who know those subjects best, and the committee system, I think, is a way of getting that aligned. So a good system by design, and one that makes sure all the stakeholders get their seat at the table. That's pretty fair.
All right, I like that. And I think here we're going to go ahead and take a break. We've gotten through everything Michael wanted to get through, apparently, which is great, but we still have a lot more for you on the back end. We're going to get into a little bit more about the chair's role. We'll talk policy, because we can't get out of here without talking policy, of course. And then we're going to talk about trains, and that may be my favorite segment of this episode. So all that and more after the break.
I'm Dr. Jen Ashton, your host for Season 2 of The Visibility Gap, a podcast presented by Cigna Healthcare. Throughout this season, we'll be tackling something vital, the women's health gap. We'll hear from real people and experts as we unpack important topics like maternal health, menopause, and heart disease. Listen in and download the new season wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally back here with Michael Sanderson and our special guest this week, Delegate Marc Korman, Chair of the House Environment and Transportation Committee. On the front end, we talked a lot about the committee process and Delegate Chair Korman's transition from appropriations to chairing the Environment and Transportation Committee, the importance of subcommittee work and advocates. Now on the back end here, I want to get into a little bit more of the chair's role, all the secrets, all the juicy secrets maybe you can share with our listeners, and what really changes. And I want to focus on the role itself and kind of get into what does actually change when you become a committee chair and kind of what has surprised you. And I'll throw something out for you. I think I've noticed, you in particular, I mean, we are creatures of the General Assembly. We're in the House and the Senate a lot. And I feel like you're having to go to the Senate a lot more maybe than you used to, right? Because you're having to deal with a lot of bills, talking to the chairs in the Senate. And not that you didn't have to do that when you were on appropriations, you were dealing with a lot of budget stuff. But I feel like as a chair, you have to interact with the Senate a lot more, and particularly with the leadership in the Senate. But I'll start there, and then let's get into just what really changed in your mind and what has maybe surprised you as a chair.
Yeah, so I do spend a lot of time, usually after crossover, going back and forth with the Senate. Try to do some of that work, ahead of time, especially on things we know are priorities. For example, this year, building energy performance standards. I know it was an important issue that MACO was covering, but it helped. It's a policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. So we spent some time with Chair Feldman's EEE committee before crossover, trying to get aligned on that. But after crossover, I'm constantly going over, mostly with EEE and the Judicial Proceedings Committee, just because of the overlap in jurisdiction, but also with budget and tax and finance, just basically pushing the bills that we've sent over there and trying to find out what it'll take to sort of shake them loose. And of course, also hear from the Senate chairs if there's anything pending in the Environment and Transportation Committee that they want to make sure we are prioritizing. As you know, there's not that much time between crossover and when we adjourn. And so, I try to spend a lot of time talking to my chair colleagues over there to make sure that we're moving what they're most interested in, and that hopefully they're moving what we are most interested in.
One of the things that you mentioned in talking about the dynamics of the committee was also being cognizant of the floor of the House and time and traffic constraints down there. And that might be the kind of thing that a rank and file member or even a subcommittee chair might not need to think a whole lot about. But as a committee chair, you kind of get brought into another set of decision making, and it's just time management and attention management for those limited hours you have for members to be on the floor and get through votes and debate and amendments and all that sort of stuff. Was that an eye-opener for you as a chair to suddenly realize that there's like a whole air traffic control infrastructure, as well as just deciding what bills to pass, but what to bring them in and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky to have a little bit of a sneak preview serving a session as House Majority Leader. So I was in some of those same meetings when those discussions were sort of fleshed out with the Speaker, so she could make some decisions about, what the schedule was going to look like and what we were going to prioritize. But I would say just generally moving into leadership, it is just a consideration that you just didn't really think much about until you were the one having to kind of deal with a little bit more and making sure that, things were flowing correctly, and that, look, the way we're structured, right, where we do committee and floor at separate times requires us to be really cognizant of time, right? Because we don't want floor to run from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day with, jam-packed important bills, and then have to go do 30 bill hearings after that at 7 p.m. Then every committee will be like the Judiciary Committee and be there till 1 or 2 o'clock. Right? So, you really have to be cognizant of time when you're thinking about what's going on in the different committee reports that are being voted out. Ultimately, though, I'm really lucky because at the end of the day, it's the speaker who really has to be responsible for that. So I can keep pushing to say we want to do all these great things out of E&T, and ultimately she'll be the one to decide if the air traffic control system can handle it.
Right. And even the bills that, you're managing out of E&T. So even just the bills that are coming from E&T, not that broader conversation of all the things you'd love to do, but for the bills that do pass out of E&T and they make it to the floor, it's also a remarkable process that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to in terms of you have a floor leader for every bill, so they need to be ready to go. I know you're ready to go. You're listening to every bill because sometimes maybe a troublemaker stands up and wants to cause problems with the bill. And eventually you have to decide also, when do I stand up? I don't want to overtake anyone. I'm not the floor leader, but when is it time for me as a chair to defend my committee's work? All of these things are kind of happening in the background. And again, just people knowing when they need to stand up is a big deal, right? And I think a lot of people don't think about that in terms of how this all flows and works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think you're right that it's hard to know exactly when to do that, and you just kind of do it a little bit by feel. And I like to think back to, some of the prior committee chairs and current committee chairs who I think sort of do that well and, get involved at the right times. I also have, really great subcommittee chairs, and they have great members who they entrust with a lot of the floor management. And so most of the time, they're really well equipped to handle it without any prodding from me.
I will note that we've inadvertently thrown a little shade on our friends at the Judiciary Committee. I would say the Judiciary Committee has a long-standing reputation of having long hearings, but I think it comes from a very well-intentioned place. I think that committee deals with some very serious, complicated legal, constitutional questions, and every year there are some issues in the Judiciary Committee that are sort of their own very, very tricky, very thorny matters. So, it is kind of a joke around town that, Judiciary is probably still in. It's only 9:30. That sort of thing is a little bit of a punchline. I don't think it's because they're masochists. I think it's because they're dedicated and really, really committed to getting things right. And they've got some stuff that really takes some talking through. They have a lot of people with some law degrees over there too. So that might be part of it.
100%. I mean, we, every once in a while in the Environment and Transportation Committee, we get a true human horror story. Someone who was killed in a reckless driving accident, someone who died of carbon monoxide poisoning on a boat, some really sad stories. And you pause and think about it and realize that's like literally every bill in the Judiciary Committee. Right. Dealing with victims and their families. So it's definitely a lot of hard work, emotionally very challenging. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to needle my friend, Chairman.
Yes, fair on both sides, I think.
So one thing I'll say, Mr. Chair, as a chairman, and I'll speak for all the people who come down to Annapolis and they got their testimony in their hand and they're ready to go, and their bill hearing starts at 1:00 and they're there at 12:45 and they're seated, they're ready to go, and then all of a sudden they're listening to you read out the bill order and their bill is 18th. And now their bill is going to be heard at 8:00. As a chair, what can you do to fix that, Mr. Chairman? Is there a way to help people understand exactly what time their bill is going to be heard? I know the answer is no, but tell me why.
Well, first of all, we actually post the bill order ahead of time, but that doesn't mean we know how long every bill is going to take. And so sometimes there are surprises, but we do try to give some general sense by posting the bill order ahead of time. Sometimes we do jump out of order for various reasons. As you know, a bill sponsor testifies on every bill, and sometimes that sponsor is stuck in another hearing or in their own committee, or they just haven't gotten there yet. So we might jump out of order then. But generally, we do post the order ahead of time, which can give some sense of when you're going to come up in the order. But a part of it is just because it's just not all that scripted. Yeah. We have a piece of legislation. I don't know if 8 members are going to have questions about that legislation, or no members are going to have questions about that legislation. And so you just have to be ready in case it's 8 or in case it's 0. And we don't schedule a specific amount of time for each bill. We allow each bill to take the amount of time that it takes for us to go through. As you know, unlike our friends in Congress and maybe some state legislatures, we also don't give every member a set amount of time to ask questions. So We're not, on every bill, it's not that each member gets 5 questions or 5 minutes of questions. And so that creates a lot of unpredictability too. But we have tried to address that a little bit, at least in the Environment and Transportation Committee, by posting the actual bill order ahead of time, subject obviously to needed scheduling changes.
And I would say your committee, along with your peers, back again to outgrowths from remote participation by new technology. You do allow people an opportunity to participate remotely. So at the end of each bill hearing, there's usually a window for testimony from people who are online, couldn't get to Annapolis. And I mean, I have sympathy for a lot of folks like that who, like, I'm not a professional lobbyist. I just run a flower shop, but I'm concerned about this bill, and I'm in the back of my store, and I can dial in and give my 2 minutes of testimony at 4:00 in the afternoon rather than shut down the store for a half day. I've got a lot of sympathy for them, and I think that's a good thing to have kept when it was thrust upon us by necessity, and now kept for convenience for the participants. I think it's good.
Yeah, I think especially if you live far away from Annapolis, it's really beneficial.
Yep.
Absolutely. So we've talked about some sensitive issues in other committees, but you're also managing some of the session's most complex and controversial bills, housing to highway policy, roads, things that counties care about, a lot of environmental stuff, but particularly housing and transportation policy have been really, really hot topics. So how do you manage those issues? Particularly with those also, there are tons of advocates. I don't even want to look at your calendar during session and understand how you manage all the meetings and work with all the advocates and make sure that all the voices are heard. But how do you manage those really controversial, complex issues that eat a lot of time?
Yeah, it's a lot of meetings, and it's a lot of coordination with the subcommittee chair, sometimes the bill sponsor, the speaker's office, depending on the scale of the issue, plus all those advocates. And we just don't always get it right, to be honest with you. I mean, I'll give you an example. I'll change the names to protect the innocent, but we had a pretty high pressure environmental bill this past year. I felt like we spent a ton of time going through the bill line by, first of all, full committee hearing, subcommittee discussion, multiple subcommittee discussions, spent a ton of time going through it sort of less formally with subcommittee chair, with council, and then meeting with advocates. And one of the advocates was not happy about the way the bill was shaping up. And so I was talking to them on the phone, and they were saying, back in the good old days, we'd all get in a room together and work this stuff out. And I'm sitting there thinking, God, I spent all this time doing these shuttle diplomacy meetings where I met with all these different groups multiple times. Should I have just had everybody in one room and just done it all at once? I don't know. So you just don't always get it right, but you just try to get as many, as you said earlier, of those voices in as possible to try to improve the outcome while keeping an eye on the goal, because you don't want to fall into the trap of trying to make everybody happy, which can ultimately make nobody happy. But you definitely need to, coordinate closely. And I do like to think a little bit about, how it's going to play on the other side of the building and, and with the governor, right? It's great for us to, pass a bill that we like in the House, but ultimately it takes, two legislative bodies to tango. And eventually, we need the governor's involvement at some level. And so, also need to think through, where's the Senate going to be on this and where's the executive branch?
Right. It makes that juggling act really difficult as chair. And it's just a different level than merely being a sponsor of your own bills and a member of a committee and subcommittee who has to evaluate all the things that are before you. The extra administration and coordination that comes with being in leadership and being a committee chair, it just takes the whole thing a couple more twists in the dive, so to speak. So I mean, we've mentioned housing and a couple other things. So I kind of want to shift into talking a little bit about some of the subject areas that are big and cast a big shadow in your committee. Both you and we have mentioned housing a couple of times, and that's certainly one of the areas that has been, temperature has been rising, I guess, on the statewide concern about a shortage of attainable and affordable housing across our state. You've got various reports, documenting we're short by tens of thousands of units of where we want to be and ought to be and so forth. Some of that policy ends up in your committee as a matter of land use and as a matter of how we mix in with transportation. So can you lay the groundwork a little bit about how those debates go and your thoughts about housing, fitting into that larger picture?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I'm in my third term, and this is probably the issue that's grown in prominence the most since I've been in office. And I want to hand it to some kind of early leaders like Delegate Von Stewart, Delegate Jeff Long, Senator Washington, and of course the governor, who have really sort of been working on potential zoning changes, affordable housing issues, renters' rights, accessory dwelling units. I should mention Delegate Wilkins as well, who's been leading on the renters' rights issues in particular. So there's just been a lot of work that's gone on to this issue. But even as we've sort of chipped away a little bit, I would still say it's continued to grow in prominence. And as a problem, we've definitely not solved the problem. And of course, the state's not, the same everywhere. Even a county's not the same everywhere. Right? Needs in different places are very different. You have an area like downtown Bethesda in my district, which is very different than even just the ag reserve, which is also in my county, right? And the issues there are very different. And there's not always a shared understanding about what the needs in different places are. It's challenging for a few different reasons. One is we do just have this culture in Maryland that I know you all are guardians of, which is most of our land use is done at the local level, right? Usually at the county level. In some cases, there are some cities with land use authority. And so any change to that is controversial, even if it sometimes makes sense or is necessary. And there's also a question of competing values. So earlier I mentioned building energy performance standards. I think that's a really great policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and use more, alternative energy. But it probably also increases the short-term cost of building housing, at least the short-term cost. And so that's a competing value between our goal of producing more housing and also, being good stewards of our environment. And so, balancing all those different regional differences, the level of government differences, the competing values is pretty challenging to do. I'm personally, committed to continuing to try it. And I think there is sort of good, reasonable ground that we can all agree on, right? It's probably not banning all single-family home zoning or preempting all local regulation of land use, you'll be happy to hear me say. But it's also not leaving the status quo entirely as it is, right? And so I think there's a lot of more reasonable ground that we can all get to together moving forward to try to continue to address this issue.
Yeah, and as you said, counties certainly are on the front lines approving projects. We're planning infrastructure and doing long-term planning. We're trying to balance that public input with long-term needs. And across the state, and you mentioned it earlier, this issue has grown in prominence more than any other. But this is one where that rift with the preemption and that the state authority versus the local land use authority, it's becoming more and more. And this is in every single county now. You used to hear it in certain counties, but now it is across the board. And I think one thing there that local elected officials often have issues dealing with it is that public input, right? And if you have a proposed project and you have a public hearing and everybody shows up and 50 people come and 50 people want you to kill it, and but at the same time you're getting pressure from the state to approve a project like that one, it is difficult to try and sit in that seat and balance that public input with state policy or state goals, right? And so that's a lot of the tension I feel like we're seeing, not just on housing, but on land use issues generally, is that public pushback and trying to balance, again, what we know we need to do statewide with, again, the feelings of the residents that our folks represent.
Yeah, so first of all, to your point, collaboration is key. Obviously, at the levels of government, it's really important that, we all sort of stay at the table and try to come up with solutions. I also think, when you talk about all those people who show up at a public meeting opposing something, that certainly does happen. But I think you need to dig a little bit deeper to figure out why are they opposing it. So are they opposing it because they just don't want any change? In which case, that's probably not something that anybody can accommodate, right? Change is inevitable. Right. Or are they opposing it because they are concerned about the crowding in their school or the parking or the traffic? Those things are more addressable, right? Those things, there is more data, projects, operational changes, things that can be done to address some of those issues. I'll also just note that I think, the collaboration is really important in the legislative process as well. We sent a bill this year. The governor submitted a bill this year that I think was just further than most people in the General Assembly were willing to go. We amended it down in the House, for lack of a better word. We sent it over to the Senate. They wanted to amend it down further. Well, it was being amended into nothing at that point, and so that bill did not go forward. But that collaboration to try to figure out during the interim here, is there something in what the governor sent, in what the House passed, and what the Senate was considering, is there something that we can, turn into an actual policy? I think it's really important that we continue that collaboration. If we don't all stay at the table negotiating, right, the desire to collaborate is going to erode, and it's going to become much more of a toxic situation between the different levels of government.
I think that lays out exactly the right roadmap. And when you have a broad policy objective coming from the governor or another, broad and important stakeholder, even if on the first try it doesn't all come together, that doesn't mean you go back to square one. Frequently, that means you pick up the pieces and say, okay, this is one we can fix. This is one that probably was a dead end, and so forth. And you try and reassemble from there. And I think counties, as among the stakeholders on those issues, like we need to be part of that rather than on the outside. So I think you've identified that right. And the role for all of us is to, find a path. So I think that makes sense. I mean, so another big area that you have referenced and that we have as well is transportation. And it was a subject area that you've been invested in going back to your time in the Appropriations Committee and so forth. And I think the current leadership in appropriations has been wise to keep you in the fold for bigger picture decisions about transportation support and financing and that sort of stuff. So that's been kind of high profile the last couple of years, as there have been tremors about the state saying we're turning our pockets inside out. We won't be able to deliver on the services we're used to. And we heard stories about, we won't be able to clean up the medians of the highways, and we're going to have to cancel all these projects and things of that nature. The General Assembly has shown up with some more resources for transportation. So can you do a little bit of a sort of a game reset on where we stand on transportation stuff? And if it drifts into some of the stuff that affects counties and municipalities in particular, that probably is good for our audience too.
Yeah, as you all know, we have a consolidated transportation trust fund where basically all the transportation revenue goes into one big pot, and then it gets basically doled out through the different programs and the different transportation business units, which is like State Highway, the Maryland Transit Administration, and the Motor Vehicle Administration, the airport, the port, and then it's not its own transportation business unit, but WMATA, the DC area metro system, also gets a big chunk of change out of that. For the counties, obviously there's a lot of important projects that State Highway or the Maryland Transit Administration does to the counties, but the counties and the municipalities, do get a share of transportation revenue called highway user revenue. You all go way back on this and can do a much deeper dive than I can. But what I'm concerned about is the current kind of deal on highway user revenue, which I know is already much less than what the counties had pre-Great Recession. That actually expires fairly soon.
Right.
Fiscal 28 is when I think the 4.8% county share drops down to 3.7. And that's, really important for all the counties. It's crucially important for Baltimore City. They actually get a ton out of that program because they don't actually have any state highways. And so that's part of a larger set of pressures on the Transportation Trust Fund. And that's driven by a few things. I mean, one, things just cost more now than they used to. We've had a lot of inflation, and even pre-COVID era inflation, construction inflation was generally higher than the sort of regular consumer inflation that most of us are used to. And we've also had some erosion because of the adoption of zero emission vehicles that don't pay the motor fuel tax. They do now pay an annual flat fee in addition to registration and things like that. But actually, the biggest thing that's been eroding our Transportation Trust Fund is improved gas mileage. So even if you're driving an internal combustion engine vehicle, it's just much more efficient now than it was 20, 30 years ago. And so even though it doesn't feel like you're paying less at the pump, the actual gas tax revenue, the motor fuel tax revenue, has been in decline. And so that's part of the reason that we've come up with a few other sources over the past few years to try to help, buttress the situation. But what we've done is mostly a held harmless type of operation. Right. Most people don't want to hear that. They want to hear about all the shiny new things we can build with the money that's being raised. I think generally Marylanders are willing to pay taxes and fees if they know it's going towards important things. But a lot of this is going to maintaining our roads and bridges and tunnels, right? It's not necessarily going towards building a lot of shiny new stuff. So we still have some looming problems in front of us. We've definitely done a lot, and a big compliments to the governor this year for coming in with a package, Chair Barnes from Appropriations, Chair Atterbury from Ways and Means, and all their members for supporting some transportation funding, which of course the Senate also hopped on board with, as well as last year, But there's just frankly still more to do to figure out what we're going to do to deal with sort of the bigger questions about the bigger future things we want to do, not just maintaining what we have.
Yeah, so obviously, I think you hit the nail on the head. We are very concerned about that funding cliff with highway user revenue. It's a big topic for counties and municipalities. It's a recurring top issue, especially when local governments are being asked to do more with less. And as you said, everything costs more. That also extends to local governments. So without General Assembly action, we will see a funding cliff. So MAKO will certainly be front and center on that issue. And again, this issue will be a front burner issue for counties, and we know our friends at the municipalities as well. So I think we want to get in a little bit to transit, and you've been a strong voice on Metro, but also expanding regional connectivity. What do you see? We have challenges there as well, obviously. Where do you see the next big opportunities for trying to address that piece of the puzzle, the transit piece?
Yeah, there's a few things happening right now. So we passed a piece of legislation from Senator McRae and I this year to set up sort of a 2-year work group to sort of look at the structure of the Maryland Transit Administration, which is a little unusual. Most statewide transit agencies are not responsible for the local service. But in Maryland, as you know, the Maryland Transit Administration, in addition to writing a check to build the Purple Line and doling out locally operated transit system dollars to your members, also runs the day-to-day service in Baltimore City, the bus, the subway, the light rail, in addition to running the MARC rail service and then planning future projects like perhaps the Baltimore City Red Line, Southern Maryland Rapid Transit. So we want to take sort of a look at that and make sure that sort of model is correct. And I think as part of that, we're going to have to look a little bit to the funding model and whether it makes sense to shift or add on some more regional funding, not only for the Maryland Transit Administration, because of course we would never just ask one region of the state to take on more without others also going along, but other regions as well. Might it make sense to sort of either replace or top off some of our existing revenues with some local or regional opportunities? Delegate Ryan Spiegel, for example, had a bill on regional transportation authorities. Delegate Sheila Ruth had a bill on how property taxes could be assessed differently depending on where you are in the state. So there's been lots of other ideas like that. Another issue that's facing us is the Transit Safety and Investment Act, which was a piece of legislation from then Delegate Brooke Learman to set mandatory funding for the Maryland Transit Administration. Also runs into a fiscal cliff in a few years. So that'll be another moment similar to the highway user revenue conversation where we're going to have to assess what it is we want to do going forward to deal with some of those needs. And then in my part of the state, the Metro system, which is referred to as WMATA, Maryland is a major contributor and a major beneficiary of Metro. In 2018, we agreed to a bipartisan regional deal to provide dedicated capital funding to Metro, but it doesn't grow. It's a static amount of money. And of course, we've had a lot of inflation in the past 7 years since that deal was set. And so there's a work group meeting right now on a regional basis, task force, I think we call it, called DMV Moves, to try to figure out that set of issues. So lots of different workflows happening that'll allow us to decide what it is we want to do with transportation. And I'll just note that, I recognize that there are transportation issues like all around the state. So of course, I'm very aware of what's going on in Montgomery County and District 16, but hear from members all over the state, rural, suburban, urban, about their different transportation challenges. And that all feeds into this conversation as well.
I'll expand one point that you made earlier on transportation, Mr. Chair, when you started out by saying Maryland uses a consolidated transportation trust fund. And for the uninitiated, the folks who don't listen to the Conduit Street podcast and we're just dialing in because of your rock star status, some of them might not think that that's really a consequential thing to talk about, but it really is here. I'm not trying to say that this is good or bad policy. Not every state runs transportation the way Maryland does, but by having one transportation trust fund that's called upon to serve all those different nodes and all those different forms of transportation, we end up with like one giant dog dish and lots of different sizes and shapes of dogs trying to eat from it. And it almost has the political effect of pitting fans of transit against fans of highways versus the port versus local roads and bridges, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little awkward on that front because sometimes the size of that dog dish is only so big. I think it's it's a nuts and bolts output of the way we have things structured here. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it adds an extra contour to debates about transportation policy and funding in Maryland because it's all in one big stream.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits to it is it allows us to leverage a lot more money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to have all that money going to one place. With something like the airport and the port, a lot of the money they put in actually goes right back out to support the port and the airport.
Mm-hmm.
Their operating dollars, their fees and things go into the fund and then go right back out because they sort of legally have to stay with those properties. But by touching the Transportation Trust Fund, they help us leverage those dollars when we're issuing consolidated transportation bonds. So there are advantages to it, but there are also, for all the reasons you said, some disadvantages and challenges to it as well. And it's just definitely very unusual. In a lot of states, they will have totally separate departments for rail and transit from highways, and may not have an airport authority at all. So lots of nuances.
Oh, so that could be like its own standalone 2-hour bonus episode just for like the deep subscriber types. I like it.
Yeah, well, we could have a lot of those. So, I mean, but as you said, it's going to take real collaboration. And I think, thinking outside the box, regional approaches, flexible tools, because whether it's a small county with a limited transit footprint or, a major metro investment, counties are significant players in this space. Counties are weighing in your committee about various policy issues as it relates to transportation and of course, funding issues. But I do think it's going to take, as has been a theme of this podcast episode, a lot of collaboration between the state and the counties moving forward to test out these approaches and see what can work across the state to make everybody, with a policy that can work for them, not just in large counties, but also in small, urban, rural, across the board. All right, so let's get into what I think, and I kind of previewed this might be my favorite segment, not only maybe of this episode, but of all time. I want to talk about trains, transit, and metro maps. We're going to shift gears. We've covered a lot of the policy ground, a lot of the wonkiness. Now it's time to talk trains. Again, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on. You are, as we've already said, you're one of the leading transit advocates in the legislature, and you're also a serious metro buff. I want to get into where that started, but also I want to know, have you swiped your credit card yet as a fare? That's a recent development this week, big news. You can now, or they're going to roll it out, I guess, area wide, but you would know better than me. But now you're going to be able to just use your credit card as you swipe for a fare, which is a huge deal, and I think it's going to save a ton of time. But have you done that yet as the biggest metro person we know?
Yeah, so they do now have tap to enter using a credit card. I'm still an old fogey and use the Smart Trip card. Part of the reason, though, is because they do all this great tracking of your stats. And so at the end of the year, you can see how much you've ridden and what percentage you're in. And so I just don't know how tapping my credit card will connect with that. And so I need to know a little bit more about that. I don't want to ruin my awesome back of the baseball card stats with Metro by going to a different system. But for me, obviously, I was a little boy not that long ago and just like trains, like probably the other once little boys on this podcast.
For sure.
But it was really just from using the system. I lived in Bethesda and worked in DC and just metroed in and out of work every day. When I went to law school, by then I was engaged and wasn't going to ask my then fiance to move to Baltimore where I was going to law school. So I would metro and take the Mark Rail. So my sort of crazy passion for it that I have now, I always had an interest in and looked favorably upon it. My sort of crazy passion for it just came from my experience being a rider of both the Metro system and the Mark Rail system for years and years before I got into office. I will say, I'm nowhere near as big as a transit nerd, and I use that in the nicest possible sense, as a lot of the other great advocates out there, including some of my own colleagues like Delegate Robin Lewis, who's a real, she's such a hardcore transit user. She doesn't actually have a vehicle of her own. I mean, so she's really committed. I can't draw my own transit maps, for example, like many of the best transit nerds can. But I do think, transit's really important. We're never going to be able to just, build roads to deal with all of our traffic problems. There's also great economic opportunity and environmental benefits that come with transit. And I'm really lucky, of course, to be in a district that has multiple metro stations that have led to just a lot of great economic development around those stations and a lot of opportunity. And soon the Purple Line will also connect into my district, which is another great opportunity. Most people in my area think about connecting to Silver Spring. That's nice. There's already a bus that can do that. What I really am excited about is connecting Bethesda to the College Park campus of the University of Maryland and beyond it to New Carrollton.
That'll be great. And I agree with you. I mean, I grew up in this area, and I remember as a kid taking the Metro, we would pick it up in New Carrollton, the Orange Line, And, now being able to take my kids, the nostalgia, and I know, Metro's gotten a lot of flack, but ridership is back up, is my understanding. And, I just took my kids down to DC on the Metro not too long ago. And number one, the nostalgia, but also the stations are beautiful, and they've always been beautiful. And there's something about the WMATA and our system and the DC system that is just, I don't know, I can't describe it, but I've been to a lot of different cities around the world, and I don't know, I'm a big fan of our system. I know it gets a lot of flack, but hopefully we can resolve some of the funding issues. It needs some work, obviously it needs some upgrades. Maryland's a big piece of that, but I got to tell you, I love Metro, and I've always loved it, and I still do to this day. And I do think it's a beautiful system. I really do. And I know there are issues, but hopefully you're smart. You can help fix those things. But I agree with you. I'm with you. I'm a big Metro fan.
Yeah, and there are definitely issues. I was in a delay yesterday going to my day job because of a signal outage. But overall, the system is much safer than it was even just a couple of years ago. Ridership, we're leading ridership recovery in the country on transit. We've had the highest ridership growth and return to ridership post-COVID. So a lot of things are sort of pointing in a positive direction, and it does require investment though to keep that going. Part of the reason our system is so strong is because it has always had a subsidy, right? A lot of the older systems, there was this idea that they didn't require any kind of government subsidy, and that's really not true of any transportation system, but it's definitely not true of transit because the DC system has sort of always had that present from the creation. That is part of what's actually made it so successful, is because it's always had that extra layer of support where we recognize fares are important and people should pay their fares, but that alone is not going to pay for the level of infrastructure that people are demanding.
Right. I can't help but drop a couple of diction things in here because that's my want. But number one, you're totally in the right place to use a word like nerd or nerdy and have no fear of reprisal. You're absolutely at home with that adjective as a very positive skew with the Conduit Street audience. So we self-identify as nerds and welcome nerds of all shapes and sizes. So you're absolutely at home with that reference. And I can't help but observe, just like this is stupid low-hanging fruit, but there's like the old mythology that if you grew up with the last name Fletcher, you might have an affinity for making arrows, or Cooper and barrels and so forth. But with a name like Mark with a C, and growing up in an area with a regional commuter rail, MARC Mark, it felt like there's maybe a magnetic pull that had an influence on you during your childhood without you even realizing it. You've been born to be a train nerd, maybe.
I have to say, it's just a very well-named commuter rail system.
All right. Well, do you have a favorite Metro station, and can you drop some knowledge for us, things that people might not know about Metro, but you do because you're you?
Bethesda Metro is my favorite station. It's obviously in my district, but also it's just the one I use all the time for work, for play with my family. So I always got to go with Bethesda, and there's just a lot going on in downtown Bethesda. Of course, we also have in my district Friendship Heights, Medical Center, Grosvenor, North Bethesda Metro Station, all wonderful communities around those stations. I will share with you all something I think is particularly relevant, which is Metro. The DC area metro system has 12,000 employees. 9,000 of them live in Maryland. And while 5,000 of those live in Prince George's County, and there's over 1,000 each in Charles and Montgomery County, Metro has 100 employees in St. Mary's County. It has 30 employees in Carroll County. It has over 20 employees who live in Queen Anne's County. There's even a few in Dorchester, Talbot, and Kent counties. And of course, the 8,000 series rail car, the new generation of rail car that Metro is going to have, is being built in Washington County in Hagerstown. So this is all a long way of saying, I think supporting Metro should be a MACO priority going forward based on how distributed around the state Metro's employee and economic base is.
It's a pretty good pitch.
Yeah, I defer to Michael, and I think, you make a great pitch. The obviously, like, I didn't realize how many employees actually lived in Maryland, so that's great to know. I feel bad for the people commuting from Kent County. I don't know what's going on there, but that's quite a drive, I guess, depending on where they are. But it is a good pitch, and it is an economic engine for sure. And hopefully, again, we can work with Virginia and DC to resolve some of the funding challenges and get a commitment moving forward. And you're obviously a huge part of that. You mentioned your work on the compact, and again, being the leader in the General Assembly and advocating for Metro support. There's a lot of pushback, as you know, but I think for all the reasons we've talked about, it's super important to make sure that it's up and running and not catching on fire.
Absolutely.
Well, Mr. Chair, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us and leave some of this for our listeners. I said up front, I was hoping to cover some ground about the nature of committees and the nature of that sort of work, but getting into your point of view as a chair and as sort of a ringleader of part of this exercise, I think it's an eye-opener for our regular listeners. I think they'll appreciate it, and we certainly appreciate your time and attention.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. And hopefully we'll have you on again soon. We're going to go ahead and leave it there. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, you should read the Conduit Street blog. But for Michael Sanderson, for our special guest, Delegate Marc Korman, and for our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm-Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.